Good morning. Today I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, Volume 2, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst. And today I'm reading from the essay by David Tacey entitled The Return of the Sacred in an Age of Terror. Dr. Tacey begins with a quote from C.G. Jung. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. The world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. This is quite a long essay, so I'm going to read a series of excerpts in this essay. Jung's Red Book throws much light on the situation of the sacred in postmodern conditions. Jung's Red Book throws much light on the situation of the sacred in postmodern times. When the sacred returns, it causes disruption to social and personal order. On January 20, 1914, Jung's soul arises from the depths and asks him if he will accept war, destruction, and mayhem. His soul shows him images of military weapons, human remains, sunken ships, and destroyed states. Jung struggles to integrate these images and says he could not conceive the extent of what was to come. I felt the burden of the most terrible work of the times ahead. The soul would bring the unleashing of chaos and its power, and the binding of chaos. Chief among the gifts of the soul will be the gift of religion. By religion, Jung does not mean membership of a church, but the attitude peculiar to a consciousness which has been changed by experience of the numinosum. He means an encounter with the numinosities in its most powerful and existential aspect. This gift, Jung reflects, is still to come, but it will become evident. I sat up for long nights and looked ahead at what was to come, and I shuddered. We shudder, too, when we survey the landscape of the sacred today and what is still to come. Our world has grown so far from the sacred that any approach of this reality to us is experienced as terrifying. Not only has our resistance turned the sacred into a hostile force, but the sacred shows its negative face at this time. Rudolf Otto designated the holy as a mysterium tremendum et fascinans. It is a mystery that fascinates, but as tremendum, it evokes terror because it presents as an ominous, overwhelming power. In a secular age in which the only authority we acknowledge is our human will and desiring, the sacred hovers over us like a cloud due to our stance. It is the darkness of the sacred that eclipses its positive and creative elements, and this gives it the complexion of destructiveness. Hence, as the sacred returns, the psychological effect is that our world feels under threat, and there is indeed much that the sacred seeks to dismantle. It has been said that the divine mirrors the face that is turned toward it, and if we denounce the sacred, it will in turn adopt a foreboding attitude. As we run away, its pursuit of us will not be seen as loving, but we will experience its anger and wrath. We live in an age of terrorism, and this is not without significance to our spiritual situation. Our inner and outer lives have a certain similitude at this time, but few have pointed to this synchronicity, because the prevailing voices are secular and do not look beyond appearances. It takes a symbolic attitude to read the signs of the times for their inward significance. Synchronicity is an acausal connecting principle. I am not saying that the spiritual climate is causing terrorism, only that there is a meaningful parallelism. The sacred today is a complex field in which anger, violence, terrorism, and conflict are intermixed with redemptive possibilities of love, hope, and transformation. The sacred is linked with war and revenge, fundamentalism, moribund doctrines, an epidemic of clerical sexual abuse, and loss of belief. Yet in the midst of all this chaos, the sacred is returning. Now I'll just make a couple of comments on this passage. Note that Dr. Tacey is referring to January 20th, 1914, which is 7 months before the commencement of World War I. And during this period, Dr. Jung was having a series of visions which were prefigurations of World War I. And it was through these visions that he became most conscious of the collective unconscious, because it was acting on him. And if you're not familiar with the term numinosum, please look it up on Google or something like that. And I might also mention Dr. Edward Edinger's seminar, Encounters with the Greater Personality, which is available on YouTube, and which, if you go on to the Archetype in Action website, you will find my transcript of Dr. Edinger's lecture. All you have to do is go to archetypeinaction.com and click on any title on that homepage. That will take you to a second page, and on the right-hand column you will then find a series of tabs that includes the word Edinger, and that lecture is found under that tab. I'll just give you the link here on the chat. In fact, what I probably should do is give you a link to the lecture itself, so just give me a moment to do that. That would be easier. Hello, Miles. Sometimes look up words in different sources. I looked up secular, and I have two significantly different interpretations. Well, I have no doubt about that, and this is where we all have to make our own judgments on things like that. It can be very difficult. Let's find this. Here's Edinger's lecture with the transcript. It's here. Okay. So I'm going back to Dr. Tacey's essay, and I'm going to share with you a ticker which gives you notice of our various future sessions, including this evening at 8 p.m., our regular reading group session. I will be talking about The Secret of the Golden Flower. Okay, continuing on with Dr. Tacey's essay. In Ion, Jung wrote that the erstwhile symbols no longer express what is now welling up from the unconscious as the end result of the development of Christian consciousness through the centuries. That is what the post-Christian spirit looks like. And he commented that it looks anything other than holy. He said the sacred had been suppressed for so long it had become contaminated with murky contents that have washed through it during its exile in the unconscious. When it returns, it will do so as a torrent, unruly with anger and wrath. The opening up of the unconscious always means the outbreak of intense spiritual suffering. It is as when fertile fields are exposed by the bursting of a dam to a raging torrent. Jung wrote like a prophet when he warned of the continued defilement of the sacred and its consequences in psyche and society. No wonder the Western world feels uneasy, for it does not know how much it plays into the hands of the uproarious underworld and what it has lost through the destruction of numinosities. It has lost its moral and spiritual values to a very dangerous degree. Its moral and spiritual tradition has collapsed and has left a worldwide disorientation and dissociation. This is what the Hebrew prophets said. If the sacred is not nurtured, the uproarious underworld will erupt, contaminating the world with the wrong kind of spirits, leading to a perilous situation. Our times have demonstrated that it means when the gates of the psychic underworld are thrown open. I'm going to read that sentence again. Our times have demonstrated what it means when the gates of the psychic underworld are thrown open. Jung said that nurturing the sacred has a therapeutic effect and acts as a bulwark against the destructive forces of the unconscious. Elsewhere, he personifies the numinous as a wrathful power. Seeking revenge for the violence his reason has done to her, outraged nature only awaits the moment when the partition falls so as to overwhelm the conscious life with destruction. Man has been aware of this danger to the psyche. Since the earliest times, even in the most primitive stages of culture. It was to arm himself against this threat and to heal the damage done that he developed religions and magical practices. This is why the medicine man is also the priest. He is the savior of the soul as well as of the body, and religions are symptoms of healing for psychic illness. Religions were developed to propitiate the powers that early humanity sensed could overwhelm life and cause destruction. Although Christianity had refined its understanding of the sacred to emphasize its good and gentle aspects, the Jews had a different understanding of the divine, and ferocity was part of its character. Christianity believes that its revelation superseded the Jewish story, but it may be that it lost something integral when it rejected the God image of the Old Testament. In Exodus, Yahweh says to the Jews, "I will send my terror before you, and will grow into confusion all the people." In Proverbs, Psalms, and the prophetic writings, we see an emphasis on divine wrath, which shocks Christians because they lost touch with this aspect of the numinous. Centuries before Christianity, the Greeks had a stark comprehension of the destructive face of the divine. This aspect showed itself when people turned away from the sacred and saw themselves as no longer obligated to express reverence to the mystery of life. This condition, which the Greeks called hubris, was severely punished by the gods. Greek drama and literature are replete with the terrifying wrath of the Olympian gods delivered to those who had spurned them. Perhaps it is time to reclaim these ancient heritages, Hebraism and Hellenism, which shaped the Western culture. While important not to lose sight of the sacred as the source of illumination, which is the hope of Christianity, in a darkly turbulent time in which the sacred is returning from exile, we have to adjust ourselves to the paradoxical nature of divine reality. There is, however, an alternative way to view this, which does not hinge on speculations about the nature of the divine. Perhaps it is not so much that God becomes evil, but the inward figure within our being, the soul, becomes malign when we fail to connect with the divine. The soul is the third thing between humanity and divinity, and its job is to facilitate the connection between heaven and earth. When we neglect to attend to this relation, the soul, as the organ of mediation, turns awry and opposes our resistance. From where we stand, it looks as if God had taken up arms against us, but it is our soul that stares us down with wrath and terror. The soul stands in for the divine in this situation, and perhaps we make a mistake when we assume that this fearsome aspect is the divine itself. We ought not assume that we can behold the face of the holy other or ascribe to it attributes that arise from the intermediary. The true nature of God remains an unfathomable mystery. The soul, says Rilke, is like a towering angel that stands over against us and yet offers transformation if we surrender to it. The soul is the beginning of terror, which we are barely able to endure, and we are awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. Every angel is terrible, and so I hold myself back and swallow the cry of a darkening sobbing. That I suspect is what most of us do. We retreat from the darkness of the soul, swallow our anguish, and refuse engagement. In another poem, Rilke writes that whoever is beaten by the angel emerges strengthened. Winning is not what we should seek, but being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings is how we develop as spiritual beings. In the same years that Jung began his Red Book, 1913-1914, the epic on the soul's eruption in modern times, Rilke was writing poetry on the annihilating and transformative forces that eclipse the ego. Okay, that's part 2. Let's see. Al says, in the news today, listening to too much bad news in media makes you ill. I believe we don't listen, it will kill us. I believe if we don't listen, it will kill us. I think there are forces trying to keep us apathetic and taking drugs. Ignore our cognitive dissonance with apathy, abdication, and willful ignorance. is a recipe for disasters. That's certainly true, and we saw that with World Wars I and II for sure. And we saw what it took to end the Vietnam War, which was a waste of 58,000 plus Americans. Okay, this is segment 3. But the spirit of the depths This is segment 3. In his Red Book, Jung wrote of the terror of the First World War. Quote, "But the spirit of the depths wants the struggle to be understood as a conflict in every man's own nature." Unquote. Modernity encourages us to live in the confinement of the ego, said Jung, and the soul, excluded and ignored, is forced to develop an ambivalent aspect. The soul arraigns itself against us as something which thwarts our will, which is strange and even hostile to us, and which is incompatible with our conscious standpoint. The soul wants something different from the ego, and we are at war with ourselves. He claimed that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. To what extent, then, is the scourge of terrorism an externalization of an internal dynamic? Here, I believe Dr. Jung is referring to the individuation of the collective unconscious of each country, perhaps, or to the individuation of humanity itself through the collective unconscious. All right, reading on another short segment. Jung said that it is impossible to imagine that religion, which has meant so much to so many across millennia, could disappear without a trace simply because secularism has seemingly taken over. He likened the religious impulse to an instinct, and, like every instinct, it has its specific energy, which it does not lose even if the conscious mind ignores it. This instinct would return, like everything unconscious, with considerable force as soon as conditions allow. It would not only return with explosive power, but in distorted forms, since psychic contents take on disruptive aspects when repressed. Another brief segment 5. Secularists imagined that spirit had died with the decline of institutional religion. Spirit for them is an obsolete idea that had been defeated by science. But as Vittimo argues, spirit was not overcome, but asleep. The secular turn put spirit in a state of suspended animation, and the intelligentsia thought humanity had entered a new world. But this was not the case. Spirit has been comatose, but it is now returning. The modern mind has had its spurt of progress and taste of freedom, and now it has to contend with archaic realities in the soul, which cannot be accounted for by secular materialism. In the early 1950s, Italian philosopher Romano Guardini had made this prescient remark: modern man sought for answers within his soul. Enigmatic powers awoke out of the religious spirit. The force of the numinous impinged itself directly upon the human spirit, either from within the spirit or from the world at large. Not only was the numinous beneficent, but also bewildering, even destructive in its impact. This sense that the sacred can be a destructive force that has to tear apart the secular fabric is found in philosophy, psychology, and poetry. Okay, carrying on. What am I missing here? Am I still online? I see. Okay, here's the live. Sometimes my technology gets ahead of me here. That's so I can bring the sound together in case I have a problem with my sound. Miles said, I've journeyed through several denominations and the United Universalist, Unitarian, and they all have left me with cognitive dissonance. Just a feeling that I wonder how many others feel too. Well, I think that that's fair enough, and certainly that has applied to me as well. And this is part of the reason that I've turned to Jung personally. Okay, carrying on with this reading. Let's see what time. Okay. All right. Part 6. Secularism had not taken the unconscious into account. There was unlived life that would blow secularism to smithereens. Secularists assumed that if religion could be denounced, and if science could show that its assertions were wrong, religion would disappear and never return. However, the religious urge is ineradicable, and to the degree that we repress it, the danger increases. Today we witness the rise of fundamentalism in all the religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and in Hinduism and even Buddhism. We live in a world in which religion and violence have become permanently associated, which is a shocking irony given that the scriptures of all religions preach love and peace. But once the spirit is defiled, it emerges in distorted forms and nothing other than a change of attitude, a new reckoning or covenant will alter its destructive course. The spirit doesn't die, of course, it turns into a monster. Fragments of the sacred are found in the distorted religious forms of today, and the perpetrators of terror quote passages of scripture as they fly planes into the World Trade Center or attack railways, buses, hotels, concerts, and media outlets. This wrath is not entirely of political origin, but has its source in an archetypal disposition. That is why the war on terror can never eradicate this violence, because we are not because we are not only talking about human carriers of evil, but a predisposition to evil in the psyche itself. This disturbance in the world psyche, and it will do a great deal of damage to all civilizations. Yep, I'm going to reread that sentence. There is a disturbance in the world psyche, and it will do great damage to all civilizations. The message for us is that the religious life has become pathological. Okay, this is segment 8. The West has managed to suppress its own negative response to modernity's disregard of religion. Loss of religion in the West does not register as a trauma. On the contrary, Westerners have been generally keen to give it away, seeing religion as an encumbrance they can do without. According to the script of modernity, religion is a remnant of a superstitious mindset that the West has outgrown. Only when Westerners suffer personal or collective trauma so that their egoic encapsulation is challenged, does religion appear as something important that has been lost. There is part of us that is shaken by the modern, but this is acted out on the world stage by hostile forces. As Goya put it, the sleep of reason produces monsters. Okay, and this is segment 9. This is the last paragraph in this essay. Secularism is too entrenched to allow any simple return to religion. People will not return to traditions if it means turning away from secular freedoms, such as doubting, questioning, and dealing with religion in a critical and open atmosphere. Only a religion that respects disbelief, atheism, and agnosticism will appeal to the West. Some will be prepared to adopt various kinds of fundamentalism, but this is not in accord with the spirit of the age, which searches for a post-secular solution. It recognizes that secularism has failed us, and traditional religion has failed us as well. Only by reaching into the spirit of the depths can we find a cosmology that will be adequate for the future. Such a cosmology will draw on ancient sources, contemporary science, and personal experience. It will only be in the crucible of experience that the future religion will be formed. I just like to point out that many of the videos in this series that I publish here on YouTube relate to finding this numinous aspect of the religious attitude in each individual, but each of us has to find it for ourselves. And I live in a city that's on the coast of the Chesapeake Bay, and if you go down to the local marinas, you see hundreds of fiberglass boats, and in the driveways and parking lots of our community, you see all these fancy cars and very expensive cars and so on. And so that is the result of secularism, in that people thought that if they had a boat or had a fancy car, they would be done and they would be happy. But as it turns out, all those pieces of fiberglass are pretty much at the dock all of the time, even on weekends. Occasionally you do see a day when a lot of boats go out, but the reality is people get to the point where they achieve whatever it is they want, a 40-foot sailboat or whatever, and then they realize that it hasn't given them the happiness that they wanted, and they move on psychologically, but the boat sits back at the dock. This is part of what's happened to us through secularism and materialism. And the good news is that if you follow this channel, you're going to find ways to connect with the numinous within yourself. And that isn't any specific religion. That's actually beyond religion. So it's connecting with the sacred within yourself. And you may have experienced this when you looked on the face of your child for the first time or something like that. Those are numinous types of experiences. Miles says, check Google on Webster's. One allows for secular to include spiritual, but neither allows religion, in my opinion. And someone named XJW Antichrist says, have I ever heard of Jesus the baby killer? Well, certainly lots of babies have been killed in the name of Jesus. There's no question about that. And in the name of many other religions as well. Mike Smekinen says, is the collective unconscious a biological or a parapsychological phenomenon? Okay, I'm going to read your question again. Is the collective unconscious a biological or a parapsychological phenomenon? I think from... so in answer to Myas, sorry, I don't know the proper pronunciation of your name, but I think from Dr. Jung's point of view, the collective unconscious is a psychological phenomenon, and he spent most of his career after the Red Book period describing it and describing its phenomenology. And that's to a large extent what the 20 volumes of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung is, particularly the later volumes. And so I guess I would say that everything psychological is metaphysical. We simply cannot physically put our finger on any place where the psychological exists in the physical brain. But the psyche does exist, is proven. It drives us forward in every way. You cannot look at anything in the room where you sit, with the exception of potted plants, and see a single thing that didn't come out of the psyche. Everything that you see was first imagined in the psyche of a human being, because it had to be imagined first before it could be produced. And so I don't call that parapsychological, because parapsychological has the connotation of a wooey-woo type of thing, and that isn't a fair description of what Dr. Jung was talking about. Dr. Jung was a scientist He didn't pursue the scientific method per se that most scientists do pursue, which is hold all variables constant and solve for X. Psychology doesn't work that way. Psychology requires a comprehensive knowledge of many things, and so it comes in the form of psychic facts, which are balls of information. It would be like a ball of string. I mean, some psychic facts, he will write 2.5 pages in one paragraph about a psychic fact. So that would be like a ball of string in which you've tied together many different colors of string, and all of them are relevant. Tonight I'm going to be talking briefly about the psychoid layer in the unconscious, but in order to talk about the psychoid layer, you need an entire page of notes. I mean, just to give you a sense of it, let me find my notes for tonight. Okay. So here I'll be talking about the psychoid layer and all these aspects of it. All these separate aspects are part of the psychic fact. And so that's the point that Dr. Jung makes about depth psychology. And each one of his points is empirically true. You can show that these things exist and people have experienced them. So I wouldn't call them parapsychological in the sense of something that's magic, wooey woo, but it does involve psychic facts, not physical facts. And so Antichrist says, have I ever heard of the end of the world? Jesus hates spirit mediums. This man is going cuckoo with knowledge like me. I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your point. If you're talking about the book of Revelation, I think Dr. Jung would say that the book of Revelation is, in fact, he did say in answer to Job and several other places, that the book of Revelation is basically the vision of one early Iron Age man, John of Patmos. And there are lots of visions that human beings have like that. You've probably had some apocalyptic dreams or visions yourself. And so for modern people who know something about psychology, such a vision isn't particularly persuasive. Okay, you can have a nightmare with an apocalyptic dream. I had one about 2 weeks ago, in fact, which I described on this channel, but it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. And it didn't mean it was the end of the world when John of Patmos had it. But at that time, there weren't many writings. People didn't know much. And so John of Patmos had enough psychic energy to write his vision down. And so a lot of very ignorant people read his vision over a period of many years, and it ended up getting included in the Bible, and then a lot of very ignorant people read that for a couple of thousand years. And so, XJW Antichrist says Dr. Jung sounds like a liar. Dr. Jung is weird. All right, that's your opinion. I think you're probably ignorant of Dr. Jung and what he taught, and so you might want to do some reading before you make judgments like that. Miles says, one of the big concepts you have presented, Skip, is that God incorporates shadow and our shadow too. Yes, that's absolutely true. And we're seeing an example of that on the chat right now. So do you believe God will genocide mankind or not? Yes, he may. As Dr. Edward Edinger observed over 20 years ago, he died in 1998, but he observed over 20 years ago that humans are going to become all one thing or we're going to be destroyed. And we now have the power to destroy ourselves. And so the question is whether humanity wakes up enough, becomes conscious enough to prevent that destruction. There's no God up there in the heavens that's going to come down and destroy us unless it's having another planet crash into Earth or something of that magnitude. Then that would be an outside physical force that could destroy humanity. There's a number of physics types of things that could happen randomly that could destroy humanity, and some will call that the metaphysical God. Maybe so. And I don't dispute that issue because I'm talking about the psychological God, but we could be hit by a gamma ray burst that we don't see coming, and that could destroy the Earth and everything on it in a heartbeat. I guess it would be a good way to go because it would be instantaneous. But what is more likely to happen is, at least in the foreseeable future, let's say, I'm talking about the next 1,000 years as opposed to the next billion years. In the next billion years, we might well be hit by a gamma ray burst, I can't say. But in the next 1,000 years, the destruction of humanity is likely to come from human beings. And that can come from the religious instinct which exists in all human beings. What book were you talking about in the Bible just a minute back? Well, I'm talking about the book of Revelation in terms of John of Patmos's vision. Thank you, Miles. Miles says he's enjoying the advanced reading room. Antichrist says, Jesus, the baby killer, will rule mankind for 1,000 years. Well, John of Patmos's visions from Revelation turned out to be somewhat correct as prefigurations and as things which were in the collective unconscious, including the idea of enantiodromia, which is the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. And so Jesus did rule at least the Western world through the first 1,000 years after the time of Christ. And then that gradually, very slowly started to break down. And by the 15th and 16th centuries, we have various events which caused the breakdown of Christianity. One of those was the scientific method and the employment of the scientific method. And as Dr. Edinger says in the lecture, which I provided the link to earlier in this chat, those people thought that they were good Christians, but they were wrong, okay? And what they didn't understand was that they were putting holes in the cultural context of the whole society. And so at this point, we'd have to say that the internet has now filled every cultural container filled with holes globally. And so we need to find as a species a new balance, because the old balances that are based on thousands of years old assumptions, which are not true, are not going to suffice, as Dr. Tacey says in this lecture, which I read. We're going to have the development of a new religion, and it's going to have to develop organically. Okay. What were Jung's views on Norse mythology? Well, let's say, I will say that he did feel that the Wotan archetype had been part of the psychic epidemic which overwhelmed the German people, for example. And he felt that those myths, like other myths, are examples of our archetypal forces. And I'll be talking about how that works when I talk about the psychoid layer this evening. So I'm going to save that until then. And let's see, I have a okay, so I have a message that has been held for review, and I don't know what it is, so let me go back into my system here and see if I can see it. And if I can, then I may. No, I did not see it. So I'm sorry, whoever's put that message up. I will review it if I find it, and then possibly approve it for the chat going forward. So XJW Antichrist says Christians are extinct. Well, that's far from true. And actually, Dr. Jung's position was that the findings that he made over his lifetime were actually findings which could be used to revivify religions, not destroy them. And so, let's see here. Okay, I'm going to see if I show this. Okay, I guess the offensive chat was somehow disappeared. But anyway, okay, so I'm going to take a break now because I have a 2-hour session this evening. If anybody puts something up in the next few minutes, I'll be happy to comment. I see that Mias Mikkonen has said something. I'm just rather confused about Dr. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. His early works see archetypes as innate evolutionary traits of the psyche, but in his later books, such as Synchronicity, as things that transcend the psyche. I think I feel your pain. I understand your because these things do get rather complicated, and they relate to all these issues in the psychoid, and they can't be pointed to directly. For example, so in the end, Dr. Jung was certainly saying that the archetypes were instinctual, and the religion-making archetype comes under that quality. And what he did say is that things in the unconscious, let's see, I was reading it this morning in this Secret of the Golden Flower, which I intend to be covering tonight. I don't know if I can find the segment here. Probably not. It's a 55-page long essay. So it's in my notes, and it'll be there. I would say that they are part of the self, and that the self is something that is, ineffable in part. Partially, it's the bigger personality in you and me, but there's something beyond that. Let's see if I can find, if I have something in here that will address this, I will show it to you. All right, maybe this will work. Okay, so here's the psychic structure. Let me correct my video. This is the psychic structure, and this is figure 5 from Dr. Edward Edinger's The Ion Lectures, which is published by Inner City Books. This is the book, and I'm using this in my course on Ion, which is conducted on Thursdays at 1:30. But the significant thing to point out here is that bottom semicircle, which is the self, and the point is that it relates to far more than the individual. It relates to the body of humanity as a whole. In other words, we have things within us, instincts within us, including the religion-making instinct, which are common to all humans. And you can repress them, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And nature has her own way of evolving. So just because you repress them doesn't mean you're going to evolve beyond a need for religion, because nature will decide. And as for the collective unconscious, Dr. Jung was describing that for 20 volumes, so I don't think I can really put a sharp point on it, but let me give you an example. The way he became aware of it was in the Red Book period, and in the beginning of the Red Book period, he had 5 visions, dreams and visions, which basically predicted World War I. And these were apocalyptic visions, and sometimes such visions are personal to you. For example, my dream from a couple of weeks ago I took as purely personal, but they also can be something that's sort of in the air and in the collective unconscious. And so what he didn't know was that World War I was coming at that time. So in this period of 8 or 9 months before World War I, he had these 5 visions, and they were quite gruesome. And he didn't know whether he was having a psychotic event. And his comment was that on August 1st, 1914, when the Guns of August actually got started, he was the happiest person on earth, because he then realized that the dreams and visions he was having were prefigurations of the war and not a psychosis within his own psyche. And so from those numinous experiences came basically his life's work. And he describes them in the Red Book, and that's why I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for our time. But I guess that's the best I can do. Mies. In Norway, people stop believing in God, but they do believe in ghosts. Well, Robert Bew says that. Robert, I'm not doubting your factual statement, and it doesn't matter much what you call the spirit. The spirit is driving us to something, and we don't know what. And whether you call it God or an angel or a ghost or a goblin, nonetheless, it's happening. And all of us, most of us do not make our ideas. We can't make our ideas. These ideas come to us from some other source that we cannot formulate. And yeah, we may adjust it based on education and training afterward, as an engineer would do. But, everything that we do comes from another source, a more powerful source than just our ego. And I believe that gradually people are going to see that in a different way. Obviously, we haven't, as humans, seen it clearly up until now, and we've resisted it. We've tried to pretend it doesn't exist, and this is what Dr. Tacey was talking about here, and which reminds me, I wanted to put on this video, so I will do the description, the bio of Dr. Tacey. Dr. Tacey. So this is Dr. Tacey's bio. He's a PhD and is an interdisciplinary scholar who works in the field of continental philosophy, spirituality studies, analytical psychology, literature, and sociology. David grew up in Central Australia alongside Aboriginal cultures and has a lifelong interest in Indigenous issues. He's a specialist in Jungian studies and a founding member of the International Association of Jungian Studies. His books in this field include Gods and Diseases, How to Read Jung, The Jung Reader, The Idea of the Numinous, Jung and the New Age, Remaking Men, and The Darkening Spirit, Jung, Spirituality, and Religion. His most recent work is Religion as Metaphor, a Jungian reading of the Jesus story. His books have been published internationally and translated into Chinese, Korean, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. He is Emeritus Professor of Humanities at La Trobe University in Melbourne and Research Professor of Public Theology at Charles Sturt University, Canberra. His education and bibliography can be found at wikipedia.org/wiki/David_Tacey, T-A-C-E-Y. So that's the author of the essay I was reading from. Miles says, seems to me the integral psychologist are very Jungian. What do you think, i.e. Ken Wilber? One of my subscribers recommended to me that I read Ken Wilber, and I've even got 2 of his books. This is one of them, Integral Psychology, but I have not yet read it, so I don't claim to know anything about Ken Wilber. My purpose on this YouTube channel is only to hopefully give my perspective on what Dr. Jung was saying. I'm not saying that Dr. Jung was 100% correct. I don't know that. And I'm not saying that he's for everyone. What I am saying is that he's helped me quite a bit for the last 31 years. And so I'm committed. My spirit tells me to make this YouTube channel, and that's why I'm here. And to the extent that I have time, Miles, to read other philosophers or watch other videos, I will, but I'm not sure I have time. I think you have heard me say, but for others, I'll say that I follow the principle of the Kevin Costner character in the movie The Guardian, who was, it was a movie about a U.S. Coast Guard rescue swimmer, and he's asked by a younger man, how do you decide who to save? And Kevin Costner remarks, I swim as hard as I can for as long as I can, and the sea takes the rest. And basically, I have to take that position personally as well. In other words, I don't claim to have a PhD in philosophy. I'm never going to get a PhD in philosophy. I know what I know about Dr. Jung's oeuvre, and so that's what I'm presenting here. And Ken Wilber is on my list, but what you don't see from in front of your camera is I have about 10 books in front of me right now, and I just can't do everything. So Miles says, I'm furthering Jung to higher levels. Well, I hope so. I hope I'm causing people to think a little bit more. And if I do that, then my purpose is achieved. So anyway, I'm going to be online again tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time in the U.S., and I urge you to join me then. I apologize, but I need to terminate this session now. So thank you for joining me. I see I have a number of followers who are listening to this live stream, so I appreciate that. And I will be back again on live this evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time.